Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast, once again with me, Tom.
And me, Rob.
And Rob, this is an episode that we promised, last week, didn't we? And it's one that we've done, I feel like this is our third or fourth time addressing the situation, but it does keep updating, it keeps renewing, so it's important for us to keep revisiting it. And there's always new developments as well, and that is, of course, the state of play when it comes to the Middle Eastern conflict.
That's right, yeah. Welcome again to any of our new listeners, of course, that have joined us in the last kind of 4 to 6 weeks, I suspect, as a result of this conflict. So, as you said, all the more reason to keep abreast of the situation and what we do know, and in some respects, what we don't. So, yeah, I think it's important to sit down and reconvene.
And I think a good starting point for this episode in particular would be the ceasefire, or the announcement of a ceasefire, a couple of weeks ago now, April 8th, am I right in saying?
I think that's what I've got in front of me, April the 8th. And I think we all got a bit excited, if we can use that term, on April the 8th, didn't we? That there was this temporary ceasefire. To all intents and purposes, it sounded like the Strait of Hormuz was reopened, trade could continue, and we could all kind of have less concern over the knock-on effects, I guess, on energy and commodities. In fact, global energy prices fell sharply on that news, didn't they? Wholesale gas prices were down 20%. So, yeah, it looked like a good reprieve, didn't it? But it's perhaps not quite transpired since then.
It did, because as we sit here about 2 weeks on from that ceasefire, it appears the Strait of Hormuz is still in a de facto state of closure, at least, with Iranian ports blockaded by the US, or apparently blockaded. There's not too much news coming out of there, but traffic doesn't appear to be passing through at the minute. It
doesn't, and updates have become fewer and farther between, I guess, and it's quite telling that a lot of the big mainstream news sites that I'm sure everyone's following have kind of slowed down or stopped some of their live feeds that became a daily occurrence. That perhaps suggests where this is at. And maybe that's a good sign of the ceasefire, that actually, look, it has been largely adhered to. I think where the sort of no change situation is that it doesn't feel like suddenly things are alleviated in that Strait of Hormuz. And of course, we've seen the counter moves from the US in terms of its own blockades on traffic, essentially.
And now is also about the time that shipments that would be passing through the strait would be arriving. So I guess now is the point onwards that we will start to see some knock-on effects from this closure.
You would think so. I mean, that was certainly what we were told at the very early days of the conflict, wasn't it? That, look, hey, we're not going to see this for kind of 3 to 5 weeks or maybe longer. Then we'll start to feel that pinch in certain supply chains. And I mean, look, the effects are in the news at the moment, aren't they? I think in the last few days we've had all these warnings again about jet fuel supplies in Europe and the UK running low, kind of calls to action that, hey, they are going to deplete very soon. Prices are all over the place on various markets and jet fuel, for example, and it's starting to hit the consumer harder, in addition to the prices at the pump, etc. So, yeah, a lot of the negative effects are going to start to bite soon, and that's all the more reason to sit down today.
And importantly for us, supply and disruption, a lot of our analysis around that has been surrounding the helium market. We've not seen LNG production restarted in Qatar, so that's still an ongoing situation. But where do we stand right now when it comes to specifically helium supply and that disruption?
Well, when it comes to helium, I think we are essentially no change. So to go back to our last updates, which would have been, say, 2 weeks ago, maybe slightly longer, in fact, we knew that there was this extensive damage to Ras Laffan Industrial City in Qatar, confirmed by Qatar Energy, of course. We knew that LNG trains have been hit, and of course helium is co-produced alongside that LNG. Prior to that, we knew that shipments, when production was online, shipments were now stuck or nothing new occurring because of the Strait of Hormuz restrictions. So in terms of pure numbers, as of a couple of weeks ago, we knew that what, 17%, I think it was, of LNG
Yeah.
would be kind of taken offline for a number of years. And we also heard that there's various reports on this, and a lot of people are questioning the actual pure numbers, but somewhere between 14% and 17% of helium associated with that from Qatar would be essentially off the table for, I think, anywhere between 1 to 3 years. Up to 3 years, I guess, is the safest option to call there. And our understanding, again, from our eminent helium experts, is that would equate to around 5% of global helium supply taken off the table for that time frame of 1 year plus.
And continuing on supply taken off the table, we've also seen in recent days a story coming out of Russia. It's unrelated to the conflict in the Middle East, but they are suggesting that it is related to their ongoing conflict with the Ukraine, because they've placed temporary export controls on helium, citing the requirement for fiber optics that they're using in drones. So this would remove around a further 10% of global helium capacity. But as we know, that's not being fed into the European market. That's mainly being fed into the Russian and the Chinese market. So hard to tell what sort of an impact that will have.
Yeah, I think it is hard to tell. I think I've seen a lot of, let's say, cynical posts around that on certain channels as well, in terms of essentially the power play that is perhaps being exerted here. There's a couple of things I would say on that. I think, first of all of this and those comments that are coming out as well, we're seeing a lot of mixed messaging, but essentially, Gasworld's Risk Watch report released at the end of Q1 actually did a good job of summarizing this. We see with helium, as well as other supply chains, these risks are no longer episodic. They're no longer coming up in the moment. They're actually embedded. There are structural fragilities and risks in a number of supply chains, like helium, like CO2, in some instances like specialty gases, where the concentration of that sourcing and supply, the fact that geopolitics and trade and tariffs and tensions are coming to the fore more often, it means these risks are embedded. And so that's the first comment here, is that this whole Iran conflict has just amplified that situation. It's just demonstrated that these risks are embedded in those supply chains, and we really have to start to build in some resilience. We have to start to counter that. The second thing is, we are getting mixed messages. Yeah, I think we've seen, I think Gasworld reported it, I had it in my notes here, that we saw China and Russia kind of put out some statements to say, we're raising our domestic helium capacity in response to Gulf supply cuts. I think China said it's going to add 250 million standard cubic feet per year of domestic helium capacity from next month. That was in April. So from around May time, we should start to see that. And those assurances were announced at Oil Chem China Gas Week. China currently imports around 85% of its helium, split between Russia and Qatar. So it's doing its bit to secure its own supplies for its own needs. Then you hear in Russia, as you said, putting export controls on, and I think it's ramping up its own production as well. It just feels like some narratives coming out to say, we've got helium and we can get it and we're fine.
Bit of a game of geopolitical chess going on.
Yes.
And before we move on, you're talking about the supply chain fragilities there. That's actually the subject of Gasworld's latest risk, or the GWGI Risk Watch, highlighting those industrial gas supply chain fragilities and the fact they are no longer episodic, but as you said a second ago, they're embedded in the industry. And I believe, without giving it away to people who haven't read it yet, this was the first Risk Watch which was given a score of 5 out of 5, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, which means severe risk, basically. We've got a sliding scale there. We've only ever got to 4 out of 5 before, I think. And it's interesting, we profiled with GWGI Risk Watch in Q1 2025. We profiled what probability of a helium shortage, 5.0, the next major world helium shortage. We actually scored it fairly low. If you look back now, I think it was a 3 out of 5. It was kind of moderate, and it underlined a lot of those points. There are these structural challenges, structural fragilities, and this kind of concentration of supply, which is more geopolitically exposed than ever before. But actually, things are plentiful. It's been stable for a few years now. Fast forward 12 months, and we're moving up to a 5 out of 5 risk score. This whole conflict has just underlined once again just how fragile those supply chains are.
And of course, it's not all about helium. There are other topics in the news and other fragilities in the supply chain related to this conflict. And the first one I'd like to mention is bromine and the supply risk threatening chip production. A fantastic piece of analysis on gasworld.com by our journalist, Anthony Wright. He says that helium has, of course, stolen the spotlight as the Gulf crisis continues, but lesser known yet equally important regional exports are under scrutiny as well.
Yeah, this is something we're actively tracking across the team at Gasworld. As you know, Tom, bromine is a raw material used by specialized chemical suppliers to produce semiconductor-grade hydrogen bromide gas. It's interesting, actually, a lot of the things we're tracking ultimately start to come back to the semiconductor sector again. It's that chips with everything vibe. We're obviously craving technology, microchips, and to make those, you need all these specialty gases, specialty chemicals and electronics materials. Bromine is one of those. It's used to carve precise microscopic patterns onto those silicon wafers that look so alluring. And in that respect, it can be thought of as an ultra-precise chemical chisel, I think Ant's written, that enables the formation of the tiny circuit structures inside modern chips and smartphones. And the thing here, we're also monitoring deuterium. I'm looking at that closely at the moment. That's another kind of specialty chemical or specialty product. We're looking at the blind spots. We're all talking about LNG. Everyone's talking about helium. We're talking about CO2, even though there's no reason to at the moment. But actually, there are these blind spots where these other specialty chemicals and essentially that concentration of where they're produced could start to have a knock-on impact in the next few months.
And on the bromine, Israel is the world's largest exporter, and 2/3 of that export capacity is coming out of Israel and Jordan, I believe I read in that piece. So it's no wonder that we're starting to see a few cracks.
Absolutely, and I think Ant followed up the next day, that great piece of analysis with another story where there's a lead scientist and director of research at an AI-driven supply chain and risk analysis firm that said bromine supply risk is more dangerous than helium for the chip industry. So we're right to be wary of this and to be monitoring it. And just on deuterium as well, that market is flying or should be flying in the years ahead. Some huge market projections for that. And I understand that Iran has a heavy water plant, which is where you kind of get this deuterium from. There are unconfirmed, unverified suggestions that plant may have been caught up in the crossfire of this conflict. And I have to stress it's unconfirmed. This is speculation, but that could be a significant source affected to some degree if that were true. So there's a lot to keep an eye on here with deuterium as well.
Absolutely, and just to pick up on CO2 that you mentioned a moment ago, last week's episode dedicated to, the UK CO2 not shortage, as we're calling it at the minute. So listeners, please do go back and listen to that.
Yeah, please do take a listen, because there isn't anything going on there at the moment, but it's kind of one of these splinter effects.
Yes, and just one point I'd like to pick up on before we bring this episode to a close is perhaps there is maybe a little bit of a lifeline in the Gulf. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz is still under that de facto closure, but we have seen the port of Neom begin to take a bit of the pressure away from that key waterway. Yeah,
I mean, I think that is perhaps slightly hopeful and slightly unsubstantiated in my view. I haven't seen enough to go on with that, but yeah, I know the story you're referring to, and I think it does look like the Port of Neom is trying to kind of position itself as another means of trade, another means of kind of routes to get product to market and around. So, I mean, if that worked out, that would certainly be a glimmer of hope. And I guess the whole world is trying to find these different ways of essentially plan B and C to the Strait of Hormuz, which 20% of the world's
energy
oil and natural gas or liquefied natural gas passing through there. So we've got to find other ways of making that happen.
Yeah, so if that potential is there, definitely worth exploring. Rob, thanks again for your time today. Great to get into these conversations and great to hone in on some of the big topics. And I think next week we should maybe return to the theme of CO2 because there's still a lot for us to unpack there.
I think we should. Just one thing I would say before we close is the story to watch for helium, really. Two stories to watch. Will the ceasefire hold? Will the conflict come to an end? If the answer to either of those is no, we could see further damage of, Qatar facilities caught in the crossfire or other key infrastructure, of course. That's an interesting one. We should keep an eye on that, and we'll start to get a good idea on that in the next few days, actually, because that temporary ceasefire was due to expire. Secondly, expect to see that containers, the stranded containers storyline coming to the fore. As you said earlier, Tom, around now is the time that we would start to have seen shipments moving and reaching their destinations and the pinch points. So that topic of stranded helium containers for our audience is going to start to really come to the forefront. And we've got, again, some great analysis of that on the gasworld website.
And these things can happen so quickly. I'm sure there'll be some people listening to this a few days after we've released it, and some of the things will already be out of date, but that's just the nature of this topic and how quickly things are developing and moving.
Absolutely, and we'll come back on. We'll do another one as soon as we have something tangible to update on. We'll be here on the pod to do that.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks, listeners. In the meantime, do please like, follow, and share the 1895 podcast, and we'll be back again next week.